Wow, this is great. This is exciting. Welcome, everybody, to Corkin Gallery Talks. I Am My Own Muse is the subject of today's exhibition. One of the most exciting elements of my job is working with great artists. The challenging part is bringing the work to you in a meaningful way and that reflects what the artists are saying. This exhibition, I Am My Own Muse, was curated in-house by Magdalena Arellano, Alicia Bojev, and Rachel Graham, and it features the work of Barbara Astman, Sondra Meszaros, and Michelle Forsyth. For you three, I would say really deeply from me, thank you for your commitment to your craft, your creativity, and for showing us different perspectives. It has been my great pleasure to work with all of you. Barbara, I've worked with you for many decades, and I welcome you from Arizona streaming in. Thank you for being with us. Sondra, thank you for coming in from Alberta, where you teach at Alberta College of Art. And Michelle, you share with Barbara, having taught in Washington State, and now you've joined OCAD, Ontario College of Art, again as a professor. So it really is a great pleasure to understand and feel the decades of commitment each of you have had in our communities and to students in this country and across the border into the U.S. So thank you all. It's also my great pleasure to welcome David Little with us. David has come from New York as the executive director of the International Center of Photography in New York, and previously has held jobs as directors of education in a number of institutions, all of which you will know, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Modern Museum in New York, and the Mead Art Museum at Amherst College. So what you all have in common, and which is pretty exciting to me, is that you're all educators, and you all care deeply about how people think about art, how people feel about art, and how people understand art. So I will turn it over to you, David.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jane. And I have to say it's such a pleasure to be here to see this show, but also this is my first time in Toronto. And I must say, I only gave myself 2 days, and I should have given myself 2 weeks because there's so much to see. I'm already trying to cram in a lot of photography tomorrow. So believe me, I will be back soon to see even more here. But to start to see this exhibition and to see Jane's space, which I had never seen, and it's really such an extraordinary space. I had known Jane's work. I was saying I've always followed her. First, I think I saw her at a show in Montreal and then at the Armory show and followed her work. So it's been so nice to get to know her a little bit more in the last year in New York City. But the real focus of tonight are the artists and their work. And I thought that we're going to spend about 45 minutes in a conversation. And if the conversation goes well, you won't be hearing at all from me. You'll be hearing from the artist. And part of that conversation, what I'd love to do is sort of touch on 3 areas. I'd love to touch a little bit on, obviously, your work and hear you talk about your work, but the subject of the exhibition and the relationship. And then I'm also hoping that we could talk a little bit about the body, which is very much a part of the work. And then we'll end, or at least make it part of the conversation, this idea of art and pedagogy, because you all have been active teachers. And in fact, I think, Sondra, I think that you and Barbara were Barbara's students, so there's also that connection. So let's just start with that. That question is, I Am My Own Muse, and if you could maybe discuss what you see as the relationship between your work and this idea of the muse and yourself as being the muse. We'll start with Barbara because you're virtual, and I understand that you're in Arizona, and also you might not be with us the whole time. So let's start with you.
Thank you. And nice to meet you virtually, even though I'm not even seeing you right now. Kind of funny. But hopefully we'll meet at some point. And hi, Michelle, and hi, Sondra, and hi, Jane, and everybody. As an artist who came through their career early in the 70s and forward, I never really thought about myself as a muse, but I thought about self-portraiture as the most absolutely natural way for me to express my ideas. There was no contradiction in my head of people saying, well, why do you always photograph yourself? It's because I have my own story. I have my own voice. I know what I want to say, and I'm the best one who knows how to say it. So it seemed incredibly logical to me. It wasn't like a big philosophical decision. It was logical. I have things to say. What do these things look like? I can act these things out. Whereas if you're asking other people to do it, and I, of course, tried it that way too, because I worked with lots of other people, but I felt that there was a greater honesty and integrity to my own practice, my own ideas, to just use myself, rather than have someone try to interpret what it is I'm doing. One thing I want to throw in here, when I first got the announcement of this exhibition, because, it's such a beautiful exhibition, and there's such a cross platform, Claude Cahoon, Sophie Teber Arp, I just said, this should be a bigger show. Seriously, when I got the announcement, all I could think of was like, there's so many other names that we could add to this. And I know that's a whole nother conversation, but so many other names that could be included within this whole idea of the artist as their own muse. I also wish that I had known, I printed it out knowing I'd be here. I wish I had known this quote, I am my own muse. I am the subject I know best, the subject I want to know better. I wish I had known that when I was in my 20s and struggling to find this voice and discover this voice and feel confident in this voice, because you did feel at that time very alone in this pursuit, very alone. So when I read that quote, it was just like, I wish somebody had told me years ago. It's a wonderful quote. Anyway, I'm not sure if I got totally off track there, David, or not.
No, that's perfect. And also, just for the group, this is on the press release. That was a Frida Kahlo quote. I was really struck by that as well, and hadn't seen it. And then, Sondra, what about you in terms of this idea of the muse?
Yeah, I think I could maybe build on what Barbara was just talking about. I've always been very interested in like Dada surrealism. Claude Cahoon specifically is someone I look to a lot. And so the muse to me was always this really complicated space that was occupied by many female artists in particular that didn't want to be the muse. And so for me, I think that's really rich territory, like that idea of being resistant to it. And so, say in my work, it's not self-portraiture, but like it's definitely using, these women are my muses, and I have a dialogue with them, and I perform through these spaces that they occupy. And so I think there's something about sort of being in that complicated in-between with them, having solidarity with them, that I'm really interested in, and sort of it's not resolved ever. Like being the muse is like, do we know what that means even at this point? So I think that's where I'm really interested in those ideas.
When I was looking at the title for the show, I started thinking, what would I put in place of muse? I am my own obstacle. I am my own illness. I am my own, problem. All of those things that I thought instead of muse, just because I deal with, my work deals with the body with Parkinson's, but not directly. Like I have Parkinson's and I make the work and I have all these body tics. However, I can make work that's built up of little marks because I can make little things. And the big things like the gestures that operate within the space, the backdrops, those are more difficult for me. So they always, when you read about disease or disability. They say, don't say that you are your disability. You have to live beyond that or think beyond that. But I find that very difficult. So I often think of myself as, I am my disease in a way. And my work comes out of that obstacle. I think we all are making work about the things that get in our way, about the things that stop us from making one decision over another. So my decisions become limited because of that. So that's kind of how I think about that.
Thank you. I think it's interesting to hear all three of you address this. The subject, the muse itself, is such a problematic term. If it's separated, and the way that you've addressed it is in a very kind of unique ways. I guess one of the things I kept thinking about, again, as you were discussing, muse has this idea of first of all, it's a female body, but it's also like a cisgender body, and it's also a body that is viewed and seen through the eyes of a male for the most part, at least historically. I'm wondering, as you were addressing your work and sort of thinking, even if you didn't use the word muse, but thinking about self-portraiture, what were the things that you tried to do within that context to try to avoid that gaze, or to create new ways of seeing yourself through representation? I'm just sort of curious on, and maybe rather than go one by one, maybe if you could comment as you wish on that. So
I'm happy to jump in because the thought was crossing my head while I was listening to both the other artists. I grew up learning Jansen's art history because I went to school in the States. So 2 years at RIT, I had a lot of Jansen's art history thrown at me. And I'm not trying to put down those art history historical textbooks, but it was when I moved to Toronto and went to OCA that all of a sudden it's like, where are all the female artists? Where's the representation of female artists? So it became this thing in the back of my head to somehow like fight back against everything I had learned from Jansen's art history. Not everything, because much of it is still very appropriate to my own knowledge and to the things I do. But having that kind of educational background kind of thrust on you for all those years, it causes a response, right? So I started thinking about, how do we show the female having a voice? How do I represent that female? How do I do this without it being sexualized? Because that was always a very difficult thing, because, you'd have some people assuming that you had sexualized the images, where really that was not the intention, but people were so not used to seeing a female performing for the camera for herself.
Well, I think similar to what Barbara's talking about, like, it's this response to the male gaze, which is always going to be in many images from the start. And for me, because I'm appropriating images by male photographers predominantly, it's so embedded in the image. So for me, the passing through the image in a really performative way with like a drawing medium or like a paint medium is to bring something else into that space that highlights actually the pleasure of the female subject. So it's like, how can we sort of take it back and make it about actually maybe there was something in that image that felt really good, like wearing leather or having like something against their skin. Or I often talk about how some of the images in the works I did called Strange Spot, the women are wearing wrist watches, so like they're nude with a watch on. And it's like, to me, that's hilarious that they're wearing their wristwatch. And so like, I also think humor is really important when addressing the male gaze at times, to actually kind of, again, address it directly, but also be like, I see you and I see you looking at me. And I think that that's an important thing as an artist, as a female artist, to really like work within that, knowing that it's there at all times.
Right, right. And in these works, it's so interesting how you show it's embedded in the medium of photography, that the lighting. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about the works that are taken directly from photo lighting books, because it's very instructive how embedded it is at that intersection where someone's actually learning about lighting.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel Barbara could actually chime in for this too, because she's quite versed with instructional manuals as well. But it's, these instructional manuals were meant to be educational, but then they were like hardcore erotica, and like not even erotica. I would say, some of it actually straddles like, what would have been considered pornographic at a certain time. And so, for me, the images within the instructional manuals I was looking at, the running theme was kneeling women. Like, it was in every single one. And to me, that started to occupy this space of like, what is being signaled through this, having all these women on their knees. And obviously there's so many different connotations that could be taken from that. But, if I take out the things in the image that are really desirable, then what happens to the image? And it slows down how you have to like actually engage with the image. And then the bits that are sort of peeking out then become this other thing.
Yeah. And then, Michelle, with your pictures, you're representing yourself in some ways, but again, not showing yourself not showing your face, showing your body in movement, and sort of resisting traditional ways of representation. Plus, you have incredible control in terms of staging the whole image as well. Could you talk a little bit about that in terms of some of the methods that you're using to try to resist maybe traditional views of the muse, or assumptions, as you suggested in your initial remarks, about the body, or a so-called healthy body?
Yes, I don't think about the body in terms of the gaze very much at all, because I started from this place of the still life. The two pieces that are smaller over there were actually still lives that were built for paintings, and I was going to make paintings from them. And then, well, not those ones particularly, but the ones that led up to that. And then a friend of mine said, I really love your photographs on your website. And I said, oh, those aren't photographs, they're sculptures. And so I said, wait a minute. I thought, no, they're photographs. They are really photographs. So I started thinking about the photograph in that way. And the early ones were photographed against an IKEA chair, which was white. That was the backdrop that I would then put the Photoshop in, because I didn't really have a lot of equipment or anything. And then I slowly amassed equipment, but it also comes from fashion photography. But fashion photography that's not really fashion photography, but photographs that you see in interior design magazines. Like Milk is my favorite, because the photographs in Milk will have maybe a woman standing beside an object that's for the house, but then that object is a sculpture, and it's an object that belongs to somebody, and it's in the space, and then the pants of the woman might be matching the object. So maybe objectifying the female in that way, because these all become props. Like everything that I wear in the photographs I've actually made. So I made the pants, I made the gloves, I made the pillows, and then in the very small one, the top thing that looks like a stone is actually a lithograph that's folded up, and then there's a silk screen on the bottom that has beads stitched on it, and a dress that I made myself. So they all come from this kind of flip-flopping from painting through printmaking through, it becomes more about that kind of translation than anything. And it's less to do with the gaze. So the pants I made, the object that's underneath my butt in these two is the object that's sitting on top of a stitched up shirt in the far piece. And that shirt, inside that shirt is a pair of pants. And in the pocket of the pants is actually a handwritten note. Because while the earlier ones were looking at this still life, they were also about, these kind of piles on the floor of your discarded laundry or clothes that I couldn't wear anymore because either I gained weight or I couldn't do up a button from having Parkinson's or something. But they all kind of are built around these notes that are inside them that have my kind of apprehensions about longevity, death, all these things I think about now. And then the photograph is another layer that seals it up. It's almost like I'm wrapping things like an onion skin.
So the text. I'm sorry. I want to continue asking you more questions. Let me move. But you're using the text as a kind of something that is for you personally, not presented to the audience, but is very much a part of what you see. Sometimes it is, but not in these photographs, but in other images.
Like the black and white ones back there, I showed them at Open Studio the first time. And the first photograph was an open notebook, and the text was handwritten. And
then, Barbara, you used text very early on to tell these stories, and I noticed that you never name anyone in those texts. When did you start using text and photographs in your images?
Text was very early. I was using it very early on, even from the visual narrative series, where I think that's what it's called. Now I lose track. 6-part Polaroid images with typing underneath. I just found that the typing clarified the thought process. And actually, I was into the whole narrative of storytelling. I thought I have a story to tell, and the photos are kind of alluding to it, but I wanted to tell a story. And then the series you're probably talking about are the large Polaroids, where I type directly on the Polaroids. And there is a person named in each one, Dear Ralph, Dear David, Dear whoever. But by typing directly on the Polaroid, it's obscured.
Let me move to another related question in terms of this idea of representation that we're seeing in these pictures. It's the performative aspects of the work. And Michelle, we were talking a little bit earlier, and I was thinking about this with your work, but also actually with Barbara's, is the relationship with the domestic object and also performance just generally. And you had mentioned that you were at Rutgers during the time of Martha Rossler, and it's not as though Martha is the only person that is part of your history, but was performance, and you mentioned earlier also that other art forms, you don't really think of yourself as a photographer, but was performance really critical in you thinking about these works?
Well, Jeff Hendricks was there at the time as well, and I do think of them as performative, and I think of all my work as performative, in that what happens from the performing of making makes the object. But what I wanted to say is the work of Francesca Woodman influences me quite a bit. I mean, it doesn't look anything like her work because her work is very blurry, black and white. But the idea that she did these pieces called The Rooms that had text on the bottom of them, that she gave to her boyfriend at the time. Those pieces I find very poignant and maybe a jumping off point from what Barbara was talking about about a little bit.
And then it seems, Sondra, you're looking at other kinds of staging of performance through these images that you collect. Is that am I sort of framing that in the wrong way, or is that at all part of what you're looking at or thinking about?
It is, and I think also, well, it's twofold. I think the performative in my work is really aligned with, and I think these references are really relevant to being in Toronto. I worked with John Scott and Kathy Daly at OCAD, and two artists that really thought about drawing and painting in such a performative way, and that really influenced me as an undergraduate. And I think the other way I really think about performances, so I do a lot of archival research. I go to picture collections like at the New York Library, and I'm really interested in sort of this idea of how the archive becomes a performative space. And just to link it back to when we were talking about text, like when I actually gut a book and then work on top of like a book page, to me that's like, and keep the text, there's something about referencing that archive that feels like such a radical performative space at times to think about research and ideas. And so I really feel like that's sort of where I'm trying to kind of, obviously on a larger scale, kind of maintain those two ways of thinking about the performative.
Now, in the newer work, it seems like you're making a little bit of a shift. So, what's these works that we talked about earlier from 2019, and then the newer work from 2022? What sort of prompted that shift, and how do you see these addressing some of the themes that you've already discussed in a different way?
The pandemic was the shift. I think really so I would say a big part of my process is travel and going to look for things, and then all of a sudden that all was taken away. And so a lot of the work became quite small scale and very much about the desk and about the home space, and like getting back to sort of thinking about collage as this like really intimate space. And so that's really where I sort of decided to land during the pandemic. It's just like surround myself with images, see what happens, and then sort of hopefully I'll resurface at a certain point to make the bigger work. But it just made sense given the logistics.
Yeah. And then, Michelle, did you find that the pandemic changed any way that you approached your work at all?
Well, before the pandemic, I took a sabbatical to focus on the home as a site for inquiry. And then I ended up being there for 3 years. And I actually taught a class called Working from Home, which Rachel over here took. And the class looked at the home not as a place to be sick and recovering, but as a site for kind of students to be able to have agency. Looked at people like Martha Rosler or someone like Felix Gonzalez Torres or different people like Jorge Pardo, people that looked at the home as a place to not only investigate, but to think about, putting on display. Or anyway, I'm going to tie that back into my work because the new works, I went out and I actually dropped the coin to buy a good camera. And I did that because with Parkinson's, going to be able to rent a camera, bring it back, all that travel I couldn't really do. So I saved up for a year to buy a good quality camera, and I started doing these large pieces. I also got a grant from the Toronto Arts Council, which helped a lot. And also I was at Open Studio. I got the Nick Novak Fellowship where I actually screen printed the patterns on the clothing.
All right, I just wanted to shift in this last part of the conversation to talk a little bit about pedagogy. Actually, I thought I wanted to. I'm going to loop back to the body one more time afterwards, but let's talk a little bit about pedagogy. When you started out, and Sondra, you mentioned some important artists for you. And Michelle, maybe you could also talk a little bit about this. As you were trying to find your approach to making work, who were some of the earlier artists that you were looking to and thinking about? And I'm sort of curious to take that another step. Who did you let go of as you were developing in your career? Maybe you thought, God, what was I thinking about? Oh, I don't want to name names, but what was I thinking in terms of my work, or you've just shifted in that way?
I mean, I feel like now that I would be a little bit shy to say this, and now that Barbara's gone, I can say it. But Barbara was a huge influence on me, and it's funny because she has no recollection of teaching me, which I get now. She was like, no, I didn't. And I was like, yeah, you did. But I say this because it was a second-year class, but Barbara was someone that really, introduced. I took a alternative media techniques class with her, and at the time, it's just like to think about like photo-based work in that way. It was very radical, and I just remember I didn't have a lot of contact with her because of the way that classes were run, but the time I got with her, it's like now I see it in my work so much, just the things she would say to me. Like she'd just be like, yeah, keep going with that. And of course I do this in my own classroom now. But she made photography very accessible to any student. And it wasn't so niche to like being like, I'm a photographer. And I think that, I don't know, that really shaped me. And it my work's always been photo-based, but I would never dare call myself a photographer. But I also, and I think that there's something in that, having someone give you permission to sort of just be free and like not feel like you can't do things. And so I don't know about letting people, like I feel like I probably have a pretty long list that I could go, but I think if anything, I went to OCAD during a really amazing time in the 90s where there was gender parity in faculty. And that's like, it was kind of this amazing time. And there were all these feminist artists teaching us, and Barbara included, that it just kind of was so eye-opening. And it really just shaped the rest of my trajectory as an artist, but as an educator, like those feminist classrooms, that's what I try to create for my students and talk about what that is and talk about how we're all responsible for that space and we take care of it. And I think maybe to link that to what Michelle was talking about, teaching online in the pandemic, like trying to create those spaces was very challenging. But also, I think something that's really happened the last couple of years is like, the way we were able to connect with students in our homes was really special. Like to get up and like grab an object from like my table and be like, look at this. Or, like there was a lot of humility in that, but also like I found myself feeling really close to my students in a different way.
Michelle, what about you?
Yeah, I'm thinking about that question, and I think the part that really where my influences come from as an educator was my first real tenure track teaching job at Washington State University. When I was there, we were a very young faculty, and the chair had taken the door off the hinges. Basically, you could come in anytime you wanted, but we were all like trying out things, doing all these different kinds of projects. Like I did a project where students built drawing machines, and then the sculpture professor had his students build erasers, and then we had a performance night where my students would make the marks and then his students would erase them. And we did things like that all the time. And when you're in a faculty that has that much kind of leeway or kind of, openness granted to you, I think that that's very inspiring. I also came from a background that was quite interdisciplinary. I went to UVic and I studied with Maury Baden. And Maury was very open and he was very different. The way he taught was very different. I mean, Maury would retire projects if he thought somebody solved them. And then I went to Rutgers to go to grad school. And I think that at Rutgers, Joan Semmel was there, Hannelina Rokeberg, Martha Rosler, of course. And so those were the people that were influencing me at the time. And I think that Joan Semmel doesn't get enough airtime because she was a painter. I think she's still around.
She's getting a lot more now, which is good, but you're right.
Yeah, she does paintings of herself, looking in mirrors or with a camera from the camera's perspective. So she's really making paintings from a photographer's kind of point of view, and she's accessing the gaze in terms of what we're talking about. But what I let go of was I really let go of a lot of these kind of male painters that I was taught as an undergrad, to love, which some of them I still love, but, I learned about, like Rothko and Clifford Still and all of these people that were making these huge paintings. And, talking about female painters or female artists, Eva Hesse is somebody that really influences my practice now, and a lot of the people that I think of are like Hannah Wilke, influences me quite a bit as well. And I've got a whole list of people that I look to, but they're mostly all women now, which, I think that came from graduate school.
Thank you so much for this conversation. And thank you, Barbara, even though she's not here, but thank you so much. So I'll give you...